Hi everyone, welcome back to Class 101. Bryce Coe here, and today we'll be drawing an illustration together, and I'll show you how I deal with all of the mistakes that I make, intentionally and unintentionally. It should be full of lots of practical tips, so let's get to it. So for materials, we'll be using the mixed media pad just for reference. All of the drawings that we did for Chapter 2 will be the objects or characters that we draw in the illustration today. We'll be drawing in the Canson Excel watercolor paper. And you'll have the full array of brush pens and felt pens, whichever you prefer. Okay, let's get to it. Okay, so I'll be using the fine tip today. Well, at least for the fine tip to start. I'll probably jump around. And then before we start, I'm just gonna do a little bit of mental sketching here. I know that I want to draw the couple of Viking characters and the giant, well, not giant, but the beetle that we drew previously. So I'm just trying to figure out where I want to place them, roughly speaking. Okay, so I think that they're all going to be friends here. And I'm going to start with the beetle. The beetle has a nice kind of rounded box head here. And then he's got those kind of like two flaps on the side. And he's got these little beady eyeballs. Really large snout or horn. Okay, so what I'll try to do is do a bit of drawing, and then try to basically say, okay, what if this is not at all how I wanted this to go? How would I try to fix it? So let's say I wanted the sides of his head be lower. Maybe the shape is more low to the ground, like this. And that's a relatively solid line that's maybe harder to kind of just ignore if you left it that way. But before you go and start tearing the page out and be like, I need to start over, just let it sit for a while. I find that that's maybe the best kind of approach to yourself, to give yourself a little bit of a breather after you make any mistake. Just let it sit there. And what I find is, the best way to deal with a mistake is usually either to leave it alone, and you'll find that oftentimes no one else will really care, or that won't really be the one thing that makes or breaks the illustration. And then the other thing to do, if it does continue to bother you after you've kind of let it marinate for a while, is to try to find a way to hide it. And there's a couple ways to hide it. You can either completely draw over it and hide it in value, basically shading over something. So let me try to give you an example on both sides of this guy. So I know that this is the kind of like neck piece part. So you can either cover it completely, and I'll do that by switching to the brush pen and just saying like, okay, what if I can just cover up that line? And then voila, not such a big deal that there's a little bit of a mistake here. The mistake that was behind the head is now pretty much invisible. So that's option number one. And then on the other side here, the other way to hide a mistake is to kind of basically try to make it intentional, make it appear intentional. So hiding it by putting a lot of lines next to it, kind of camouflaging the mistake essentially. And so we talked about using rhythm to kind of increase the concentration of line strokes here, so that those lines there don't really feel like they come to the front of our attention as much. This is kind of just drawing straight over it as if it weren't there. If you still find that this is really, something like this is really distracting, you might want to take it a step further and say, okay, maybe I can turn that into like a pattern. So this happens to feel a little bit like a cross contour on the shell. So if I want to go and just keep doing a similar pattern on the rest of it, and I will need to do it everywhere else as well, then maybe you can turn that into a design element. So a lot of the things I'm not even thinking about, I'm just trying to hide mistakes at this point, are turning into details that really try to make those mistakes just blend into the rest of the lines I have. With these front places, I think let's see, maybe I can try to make those into a design pattern as well. I know the original model that we looked at was full of detail, so we want to make that into maybe a textural flourish there. Kind of already had a similar thing going, because I know that he had this beetle had like some sort of pattern going on at this point. So this kind of pattern or rhythm of line here, where things are kind of flowing in a very similar spacing from each other, using that to our advantage and really doing pretty good at hiding that mistake. The only lines that shouldn't be there are this line here and this line here. Otherwise, the other ones kind of can feel like they were intentional. I'm just going to keep drawing here. Okay, so you see that these aren't symmetrical, and as wings they probably would be, but I feel like it's not such a big deal, even though this one is like, what's the word, convex, and this one's like concave, as far as a line that would go from point to A to point B. I probably would just leave this alone, but if you didn't want to, then first step, I would say, let's just leave it alone for a minute. If it keeps bothering us, then we can return to it. Okay, so I don't want to just keep drawing this bug guy over and over, or exclusively the bug guy for this example, so I'm going to try to incorporate some of our other characters into it, but I'm going to intentionally, or maybe say this was unintentionally, kind of take up too much space here. And then let's say I just basically forgot I was going to draw additional characters on the side here, and I already kind of took up way too much space on that side. And look, here's a mistake that was not planned. I just drew this wrong. And the width of this is too wide here. Just gonna ignore it. We'll try to hide it later, maybe. Okay, so what kind of relationship do the Vikings have to this guy? Originally, I wanted them to be friends, but he looks like he's kind of upset. So what's the story here? Maybe it looks like they're all focused on something here. I'm going to draw our Viking friend, the guy, right here. And I'm using eyebrows again to kind of define this front box here, this front plane. And you'll see I'm drawing in that box for you, not only for you guys, but also because if these lines are still here, they're not a big deal either, because they kind of just are like strengthening his forehead shape, maybe making his cheekbones stand out a little bit more. But I can also just hide them. Not a big deal. Just draw over them. I think he has like a couple hanging bangs here or something. Okay, and so one of the most common mistakes that I make personally is like misplacing the mouth. So let's say I put it down here, and it's like, oh, that's too low. He's got kind of a long face if I do that. I find that the best way to deal with something like that, where you really are going to notice it forever, is if I have the like ability, I might just might alter the character design to like kind of put a scarf over it, or you know, add some sort of other design element to cover it up entirely. But in the case of our Viking guy, he kind of has a beard that can function in the same way as like a mask. So I basically connected the top of the mouth to become the bottom of the mouth, and I'm going to use the fact that he's got beard to kind of like messy this area up and camouflage the mistake as maybe just being part of the beard. And I completely have this giant tentacle thing in front of the guy, so either I would need to kind of have him positioned behind this tentacle, which doesn't quite make sense, I think, given the space. The ground is probably somewhere around here, so I'm gonna just draw over it, and that's another way to just essentially ignore any mistake. I think one of the most difficult problems about making a mistake is kind of the emotional, mental kind of toll that it takes when you're like, oh man, it was going so well, and then all of a sudden everything's wrong because I made this big mistake that I really didn't want to make. But fighting through that and just saying, I'm going to finish this, or I'm going to use this as an opportunity to see if I can learn how to better hide mistakes, which needs to be a skill that you have, because it's impossible not to make them until you reach a really god level status. Then this is something that you need to work on as part of your arsenal. So I'm just going to draw over it. And then after you draw over something and let it sit for a while, you'll also be giving yourself time to brainstorm on maybe a better way to hide the mistake. So here, I'm gonna go straight over this other really prominent shape that we spent time on. Maybe it's like super important that he be in this pose for your story that you're trying to tell, or for whatever reason, maybe you really needed to have him be in front. He had like a fur coat thing or something, right? So after a while, after you've kind of like rendered enough of the drawing that you know, is going over the mistake, you might just even like feel like the mistake is not something that you even feel bothered by. You might just not see it anymore. I think that's what happens to me really often. And then when someone else looks at the work, they often don't notice it either. And that might be a style choice as well. A lot of the illustrations I do by an aesthetic choice have like a really complex, detailed atmosphere. And that's not only because I like those kinds of drawings, but also that style gives you a lot of flexibility to hide mistakes. So I think I grew into that style because I would do things like this where I would get really good at hiding mistakes with just adding detail on detail on detail. I don't really know what these guys are doing. I feel like they're like jostling for something. Here are the cylinders for legs. Sitting on that hip, which is connected to that chest box. Underplane of the foot box here. Some details on this boot. Okay, so now that we've just completely drawn over this tentacle, or I don't know, feeler that this guy has, I personally feel like this area here doesn't bother me too much, but what does bother me is that this is a clear shape. I'm not going to cover up because it's so close to this guy's face, but I need to make that make sense. So I'm going to focus on fixing that part. I'm going to connect this line here like that. And the rest of this, I'm gonna try to hide it maybe with some value, kind of more like this. So if we give him darker pants, decide to shade one plane of those foot box cylinders. And this is all hand here, so we can either choose to make the hand darker or the kind of belly area or his chest. And I think I want to go with that chest because it'll make his hands pop a little bit more. So kind of like just disrupting this line here with any of the parts of the body we can shade that kind of makes sense. And then camouflaging it by making that not the only place that we do it, but kind of spreading that out to be part of the style of the drawing elsewhere as well. That'll help kind of pull the eye away from these inconsistencies. I'm going to shade the inside of his hand. Cool. And then he also had this emblem here, so that's switching back to the fine tip, but this kind of emblem that he had on his chest, this is a great opportunity to also kind of hide that line there. things over here. So for the other character, female Viking, drawing in her head. This is her hair. She's got like kind of a crazy one-sided ponytail thing going. Alright, so I kind of drew her head maybe too angled downward. And so I might be like, oh god, I completely ruined this drawing. I actually wanted her head to be over here or something, right? So I'm just gonna decide to draw what I want to draw. This time starting with the eyebrow line. I'm just going to let all those mistakes over there just kind of marinate and simmer while I figure out what I want to do with them. I messed up some of these lines here. I just decided to kind of hide them in value. But all these lines here, I can't make this whole thing just all dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to camouflage it into her hair, because I know that her hair was kind of planning on going in that kind of direction. So kind of reappropriating these lines to serve a different purpose. Requires you to be a little bit more clever and maybe a little bit more lucky with the mistakes that you make. But sometimes you'll just find like, maybe I could say that this was just all part of her hair. It's obviously going to be contextual based off of wherever you are in the drawing, if you can find a way to make it make sense. So I'm turning this into the end of her ponytail. That ear there is a funny thing. We can kind of add details to the hair to maybe make this braid have, just maybe it was tied up in certain knots or things like that. And then that inconsistency in that this overall kind of flow and rhythm of line can be broken up in a way that maybe feels a little bit more intentional. Okay, what does her design look like? Let's take a quick look. She has kind of like a scarf here and then armor. So her armor, she had shoulder pads. And okay, cool. There's another good place to draw or to make a mistake. So let's say at first I draw her arm out like this, all the way out here, and I get pretty far along before I decide, oh dang, wait a second, I wanted her to be holding a sword in a completely different way. I'm just going to draw the correct line, correct arm I wanted to draw. The correct one I wanted to draw was to have her sword coming this way. the important thing is mostly that you don't just give up. You gotta have the sort of grit to bear with the fact that you're gonna make mistakes. It's impossible not to, and I just find that even when you want to give up because of something like maybe as large of a mistake as that, it's not that big of a deal actually to just draw the correct line and leave the incorrect line right there. Either you can hide it, as we talked about, or you'll find that it really wasn't as big a deal as you thought initially. Okay, I'm not sure if she had any details on the chest. It was kind of obscured in our reference, but I'm going to add some. And we'll just let this arm hang out until we can figure out what to do with it. Do some foreshortening on this leg here, and let's say we draw the leg trying to go back that way. It's all covered by this well-positioned sword. I drew this foot wrong. Just gonna keep drawing until I get it right. I'm getting lost in this right now. Okay. So a lot going on here. I feel like this is confusing for me to look at. And I feel like maybe one way to kind of hide all these like almost sketch lines that I did, instead of having kind of a clear shape there, I would definitely want to just hide some of that. So I'm going in with the brush pen, doing the Pentel this time. I'm going to just color her legs in. Try to make it look like she's wearing some sort of shiny leather or something on the thigh area. And then for this foot here, which has a strong incorrect line going through it, I'm also going to hide that one in value. But just be sure when you have a correct line, don't color all the way up into it. I think it reads better if you allow that to breathe whenever you have a line that you do like that. Okay, so I just can't help myself. I'm going to draw in what I really want to draw here. I don't know if you saw this coming. But it's the thing I want most. Delicious, delicious fish meat. Drawing over his tusk there, or horn. Not a big deal, because I'm going to shade this in so much that you can hardly feel that there's something supposed to be behind it. Same for this part here. Just make it a stylistic choice. You often also need to have that kind of variation of value in a drawing to add clarity and to highlight what's important. Not that this boot was important or anything, but maybe making this back part darker versus this sword being kind of more clean and pristine. That separation of material through value. Maybe something we needed, and you know, just happens. So this texture here, maybe I can make that part of the pattern for his tentacles. Calling it something different every time I refer to it. Adding it over here for consistency. These guys, I know the story now, they're fighting over lunch. It's a very silly drawing. Okay, so let's try to deal with this kind of mistake here. I'm going to do a couple other things too. So let's say I draw these wings in. And his body, or his the back of his butt here. Maybe some legs. Okay. So what I want to just show off real quick before we're almost done is other ways to kind of blend mistakes out of focus. So this is one. I need to make another one. So let's say I drew his axe over here on his hip, but actually I think that I shouldn't have drawn that axe. He always has his axe up here. Cylinder connected to this weird shape that doesn't really need to even be in 3D. There's that, and then he also had a helmet, I think. Okay, so let's say I want to get rid of this shape that maybe I even went so far as to kind of do some cross contour and detail work on. The background is a great opportunity to deal with that kind of stuff. So I know we did one drawing over here that was the tree stump with mushrooms. Any sort of repetitious element like mushrooms or grass or moss are really helpful to blend things out of focus. So even though this is really strong here, these lines, reappropriating it into the background, let's make this the top of a tree stump. And then on the side of it here, I'm going to turn those into mushrooms. Just don't give up when this happens. You make a big mistake, don't give up. Be like, what can I do to save the drawing? It's not too late. I could have probably just left the axe there in this case. In a lot of cases where you feel like, oh, I didn't want to do that, it's probably not a big deal if you do, just leave it. But just trying to show how you can have it both ways sometimes. Another thing, to be honest though, is once we get into color, color is another way that will show how to, if you had honestly just colored the axe at the same correct color as the background, and then colored correctly his body here, you probably would also really not notice the axe nearly as much. And then some of these shapes here that were part of the axe, maybe turn those into grass. Bigger leaves over here to make that feel like it's more part of the drawing. And I find it also works much better when if you're gonna add in a detail just to hide a mistake, make sure you use that detail in other places outside of that one area to definitely mask it some more. So I'm gonna draw some more tree stump back here and mushroom. Mushrooms don't look like much, but if you were to color them, you could do a lot more. So making that consistent throughout here. The fact that there's grass, sometimes leaf elements. Why is there a piece of fish here? This on this wooden stump. Very low to the ground wooden stump. Some small dash cross contours to make this tree stump have a stronger shape. Tree rings kind of helping pull the eye around this. Mirroring the line flow over here towards the center. And now I'm back onto this arm that is just floating out of her side, right? And let's make the ante even harder. Let's say we had drawn some cross contours on here for making that we were like really set on having the arm down there until we realized we didn't want it. Going to let's see, can we do something besides drawing a tree on top of that? You know what? It happens to kind of align with how big this guy is, you know? This is also just contextual, the fact that we have a giant bug here who we know has these kind of like similarly thick arms. So just turning that into a bug leg alone, that's not too bad, but you might want to just add a couple more back here to once again camouflage the mistake as appearing to be part of an intentional design choice or composition choice. Still going to have some of those mushroom and tree trunk elements. And here, where the shoulder kind of came in too much, that might be a bit of a stretch to just have these things side by side, because there's no separation of value here, so these two things are kind of fighting for the same amount of attention. So for something like that, you might need to have a separation of through value, or coloring something in essentially. So I'm going to make a larger tree trunk here. Some more leg shape to kind of fit into there, and I'll want to mirror that over here. I'll need to get out my brush pen again, just because it's easier to fill in value, honestly. In this case, it's not exactly because I want the texture of the brush. I often use brush pen just because it's faster to fill in something. So I'm going to make this a darker tree stump. some of those grass details. And the line quality of the background being rougher and more reliant on some of these brush strokes that have texture can also be a great way to kind of separate your focal point or your characters from the other elements that are on the image. So choosing over here, for example, kind of lean into having a darker blotchier background versus the kind of more clean lines in the front. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it for today. Now let's talk about your mission, which will be to draw your own illustration using any object that you've drawn up until this point. So that can include anything from chapter 1 or 2. I'd like you to use the same Canson XL watercolor paper, but you can choose any pen that you prefer. The last requirement here is that you need to finish this drawing whether or not you make mistakes. If you do make mistakes, then hopefully some of the tips that we went over today can help you with that. So to do a quick recap, you can choose to ignore the mistake, and I recommend you do this just to give yourself some breathing room before you make any decisions. 2, you can try to hide the mistake through value or through camouflage. And 3rd, you can try to repurpose the mistake to turn it into something that makes sense in context. And with that, we're done with chapter 2, Drawing with Ink. In the next chapter, we'll move on to expanding our visual libraries, and I'll walk you through what I do when I'm preparing for a big illustration. Looking forward to sharing that with you in the next chapter. See ya.